Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This is the fourth in a series of programs I'm doing on the great French wisdom writer Michel de Montaigne. Last week, I began focusing on Montaigne's essay on education and related essays. He addresses himself to the question, what are the most important things we can learn in life? Allow me a brief review of last week's program. This, of course, is also for the benefit of people who may have missed the first three segments of this series. So again, a brief review. Montaigne is considered to be one of the great essayists of all time. He lived in 16th century France. He died at age 59 in the year 1592. His essays focus on the human condition. Montaigne stimulates our thinking about what we can all do to live more satisfying lives. Montaigne was highly critical of the education system of his day. He claimed that education, while he was alive, placed far too much emphasis on memorization and not enough emphasis on critical thinking. And also, he believed that the education system of his day generally failed to prepare students for the ups and downs of daily living. The main purpose of education, including the process of lifelong education, according to Montaigne, was to help people cultivate wisdom. And what was wisdom, according to Montaigne? Well, it's the knowledge of how to live well and die well. Die well? Yes. What did Montaigne mean by that? Well, Montaigne believed that if one acquired wisdom, one would be able to face one's mortality with tranquility, in contrast to fear. The purpose of a school or university, according to Montaigne, was to help students become better and wiser people. A wise person, according to Montaigne, is a person who can manage his or her life reasonably well, especially the frustrations and difficulties of daily living. Also, a wise person looks in the right places for tranquility and joy. Montaigne believed that many people live very unsatisfying lives because they look in the wrong places for tranquility and joy. Montaigne also believed that a wise person is a person who is making a serious effort at being a decent person, a moral person, a kind person. For Montaigne, wisdom is never divorced from virtue. According to Montaigne, schools must help students. Schools must help students jump the gap from memorizing to thinking. Memorizing is very different from understanding, from learning, from being able to use and get help from what one has studied. Montaigne also placed great emphasis on good judgment. He believed that students must be helped to cultivate good judgment in everyday life. He believed good judgment will better serve people than a good memory. The educated person is also a self-critical person. The educated person habitually engages in introspection, aims at a greater self-understanding. Greater self-understanding will facilitate a person's efforts to manage his or her life well. Montaigne believed that as a result of self-study, we should sometimes hug ourselves and sometimes correct ourselves. Montaigne wants students, indeed all people, to think about what's really important in life. He believed society usually confuses people about what's really important in life. He believed the world, for the most part, is governed by false values. And an obvious example he often gave is that so many people attach much more importance to social status than to virtue. Montaigne believed that many students do well in school but flunk life for a variety of reasons. For example, poor judgment or inappropriate values. Montaigne believed that philosophy is the most important subject one can study. He believed that philosophy, if taught well and studied well, is the best subject for teaching people how to live well. Montaigne's favorite philosophers were Plato and Seneca. Remember, Montaigne was living in the 16th century. Plato and Seneca had written their books more than 1,000 years before Montaigne was born. And among the books that Plato wrote, that Montaigne felt was especially valuable in helping him to achieve wisdom, was Plato's book entitled The Apology, and also another book by Plato called The Republic. Incidentally, later on in this program, I hope to have time to talk a little more about books that might help people to achieve wisdom. I mentioned that Montaigne also admired Seneca, a great writer of antiquity. And the book that Montaigne most admired, it's a book you can still buy at any good bookstore or access at a library. It's Seneca's book entitled Letters from a Stoic. Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, capital S-E-N-E-C-A. Few writers have had as much of an impact on my life as Seneca. Montaigne believed that besides philosophy, that history is also a very important subject, provided, of course, that it is taught well and studied well. The great Russian novelist Tolstoy explains Montaigne's viewpoint as to why history is such an important subject. Tolstoy said this: the aim of history is to teach humanity and nations to know themselves. In other words, history is the record of human behavior. History, in a sense, is a species of psychology. Napoleon, by the way, believed that. Montaigne believed that history, if taught properly, can help students to come to a better understanding of human nature and can help students to learn to think critically. Montaigne said this, and I'm quoting him: "Let the students be taught not so much the facts of history, but how to judge them." What's he talking about here? Allow me to explain. Montaigne contended that if in a history class the teacher was teaching about slavery or religious wars or the Industrial Revolution or imperialism, that one of the questions the teacher should habitually ask in a history question is this: does this tell us anything about human nature? Again, does slavery, the fact it existed in virtually every part of the world at one time, does this tell us anything about human nature? Does the Industrial Revolution tell us anything about human nature? Does imperialism tell us anything about human nature? And if Montaigne were alive today, I submit to you that he would tell American history teachers that one of the things they should be doing in their class is this: they should be, first of all, asking students, what does a particular aspect of American history tell us about America? And also, towards the end of an American history course, two very appropriate questions would be, what should Americans be proud of? And what should Americans be ashamed of? You recall, Tolstoy said that the aim of history is to teach humanity and nations to know themselves. This latter question, by the way, would be appropriate in all cultures, so that Japanese teachers, after teaching Japanese history, should ask their students, and what should we Japanese be proud of, and what should the Japanese people be ashamed of? If an American history teacher is teaching the Constitution, Montaigne, I'm quite confident, would suggest that the teacher ask this question: what does the Constitution, what does the U.S. Constitution tell us about the Founding Fathers' view of human nature? If, for example, one is studying the system of checks and balances in our Constitution, whereby the President and the Congress check up on the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court checks up on the President and the Congress. You know, this system whereby each of the three branches of government checks up on the other. Well, an American history teacher should, of course, ask the students, why do you think the Founding Fathers instituted this system of checks and balances in our government? And of course, one of the answers is that the Founding Fathers believed that human nature, being what it is, that people in government would tend to abuse their power if there weren't checks on their power. So again, Montaigne wants history to be taught to all people, but also he wants people to have their thinking stimulated in history course about what the facts mean. The fact is, history is often poorly taught. Students are often called upon to memorize facts and dates with little understanding of their significance. Montaigne believed that education should also prepare students for the difficulties they will encounter in life. And he believed one of the ways to prepare students for their future lives, besides studying philosophy and history and literature, was vigorous physical exercise. Montaigne, like the ancient Greeks, attached a lot of importance to physical education. And he said this, and I'm quoting Montaigne, "A boy must be broken in to the discomfort and hardship of exercise in preparation for the difficulties he will face in life. For example, illness, accidents, war." Montaigne indicates that physical exercise is good for the mind as well as for the body, that physical exercise can help relieve us of stress. You recall the ancient Greeks, for example, Plato. Plato talked about the idea of a sound mind and a sound body. And Plato, like Montaigne, attached a lot of importance not only to educating the mind, but also exposing students to physical education. Montaigne has not been alone among the great thinkers in claiming that schools often do not prepare students adequately for their future lives. Freud, for example, was a serious critic of education in his day. Freud claimed that schools generally did not prepare students for the real world. And among the specific examples Freud gave were the following. Freud said schools rarely prepared students for the role that sexuality would play in their lives, and that schools did not prepare students for the degree of aggressiveness they would encounter in their fellow human beings. You recall, Freud believed that human beings are innately aggressive and that students should be prepared for this unfortunate trait in human nature. Freud believed that Freud believed that students often left schools with a false psychological orientation. And part of this false psychological orientation, according to Montaigne, is that schools, at least unintentionally, lied to students about the morality of the majority of people. Allow me to give you Freud's own words. It becomes evident that a certain misuse is being made of ethical demands. The strictness of those ethical demands would not do so much harm if education were to say, this is how men ought to be in order to be happy and to make others happy. But you students have to reckon on their not being like that. Instead of this, the young are made to believe that everyone else fulfills these ethical demands. That is, that everyone else is virtuous. It is on this that the demand is based, that the young too shall become virtuous. So Freud's contention was that many students leave school naive in the ways of the world, and especially naive in not understanding human nature, not realizing that the majority of people are neither very wise nor very moral. By the way, this is one of the reasons that Montaigne believed that philosophy should be a required course in all schools, and indeed in France today it is. And I have little doubt if Montaigne were alive today, he would want psychology to be a required course in every high school in America. Why is it that students must wait until they get to college to study psychology? And of course, many people never go to college, and therefore are never exposed to the benefits of studying psychology. Today, there is much talk about what standards to use in judging the progress of students in our schools. I mentioned in my last program that today education is a hot-button issue. So many politicians talk a lot about it. Well, for Montaigne, what was the ultimate test of one's education? Well, it wasn't SAT tests, which didn't exist in his day. It wasn't admission to so-called prestige schools or colleges. And Montaigne also would not judge one's education by what grades one might have gotten in philosophy, history, literature, or other subjects. But rather, Montaigne would judge a person's education by how well that person applied what he learned in school to his daily living. For Montaigne, the ultimate test is this: how does a student live his life? And how will a student live his life? For Montaigne, education should teach a person to regulate his behavior and his or her morals. You recall Montaigne said this, and I'm quoting him: "There is nothing so difficult as to learn how to live this life well." He also went on to say, "It takes good management to enjoy life." Montaigne believed there were some very specific standards we could use to judge how much a student was progressing and becoming better educated. And let me again give you Montaigne's own words. "Our pupil should not so much say his lesson as perform it. He should repeat it in his actions. We shall then see whether there is any wisdom in the student's future plans, any goodness and justice in his conduct. Again, if one is trying to judge whether a student's education has been a good one, whether he's making progress, is there any goodness and justice in his conduct? Any judgment and grace in his speech? Does the student know how to speak to other people? According to Montaigne, when an educated person speaks to someone else, that person's conscience and virtue should shine out in his speech. Is there any fortitude in the student's bearing of sickness? Montaigne attached a lot of importance to fortitude, to endurance. He believed that life is often difficult and that one of the things we must all cultivate if we're going to become better educated and much better able to handle the ups and downs of everyday living is this: we must all cultivate fortitude and endurance. So one of the ways he would be judging a student's progress would be by whether they were cultivating fortitude and endurance. Also, is there any moderation in the student's amusements? Today, for example, is the student addicted to video games or even sports? Montaigne, like Aristotle, believed that one of the rules of life was this: nothing in excess, nothing in excess. Also, again, Montaigne's words: is there any temperance in the student's pleasures? Is there any temperance in the student's pleasure? For example, in his or her eating, drinking, sex, consumption of material goods. Again, the rule: nothing in excess, whether it's eating, drinking, having sex, or consuming material goods. Contrast this with our society and how we judge a person's education. Generally speaking, in our culture, whom do we judge to be the best educated people? And how do we judge who the best educated people are? Well, I think it's fair to say we use grades, degrees, and also we want to know which schools a person has gone to, that so many Americans assume. If a person has a degree from a so-called prestige college or university, that person is better educated. Isn't it true that many high school students who get the highest grades often experience much stress in their senior years in awaiting acceptance or rejection from schools like Harvard, Yale, University of Pennsylvania? Question: can one be certain that one will get a better education at a prestige school in contrast to one that is not a so-called prestige school? It's an important question. Well, a New York Times reader, in a letter to the editor some years ago, I think hit the nail on the head in getting us to think more clearly about this. He was alluding to some New York Times articles about how many good students in America anguish about getting into an Ivy League school, for example. And here is what this New York Times letter writer said, and I think it helps put things in perspective. Again, I'm quoting him. By the way, his name is Luke Wilson. Success is measured by the school's name and not by the actual education or personal growth. This misdirection forces students to value illusion over reality. Again, so many people seem to evaluate a person's education by the school's name and not by how much personal growth the student experienced at that school. Remember, for Montaigne, the best test of a person's education is not what schools he or she went to or what grades he or she got, but how a person lives his or her life. This includes how a person manages the fact that he or she is going to die someday, and whether the person has gained any wisdom from facing up to one's mortality. The idea is, if one keeps in mind that one is going to die someday, one might be more inclined to use one's time more wisely, realizing that our time to live and love is limited. Montaigne believed that wisdom is the knowledge of how to live well and die well. In a sense, according to Montaigne and his standards, our final grades cannot be entered until after we die. As is my custom, I'd like to conclude this program with a quotation from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau believed we are all artists, and in Walden, his masterpiece, he penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."